The vault door groaned open like a secret that had waited decades to speak. Inside, under the cold glare of emergency lights, the truth that Queen Elizabeth II took to her grave finally stepped into the open. Not the public fortune, not the crown estate, private funds, personal, carefully ring-fenced. And every last line pointed straight at one name, William. King Charles III did not receive the news in a quiet study with a cup of tea. He received it in the middle of a private audience that was supposed to be about garden renovations at Highgrove. The equerry's voice cracked once. Charles's hand froze on the arm of the chair. The color drained from his face so completely that the staff later whispered he looked as if someone had reached into his chest and switched off the light. For 70 years Elizabeth had ruled with a smile that never quite reached the private ledgers. The public saw the monarch who never put a foot wrong. The family saw the mother who balanced affection with iron calculation. And now the calculation had spoken. The private funds, investments built quietly over decades, properties held outside the official royal portfolio, cash reserves that never appeared in any public accounting, had been directed, in clear and final terms, to the Prince of Wales and his line. Charles had expected continuity. He had expected the natural order. He had expected that the private wealth of the House of Windsor would flow, as it always had, toward the reigning sovereign. Instead, the documents laid out a different architecture. Elizabeth had drawn a line. On one side stood the crown and its public obligations. On the other stood a private fortune she regarded as hers to bestow, and she had chosen the grandson she trusted most to carry it forward. The first reaction inside the palace was silence so thick it felt physical. Then the phones began to move. Private secretaries, trusted solicitors, the handful of people who still held the old access codes. Within hours, the story that had been locked in a vault beneath the palace was already leaking into the outer rooms of Clarence's house in Kensington Palace. William was informed carefully, almost gently. Charles was informed like a man being told the ground beneath him had shifted while he slept. Those who saw the king that evening describe a man who looked suddenly older. The famous composure cracked at the edges. He asked the same question twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the answer. "Are you certain these are private?" he said. "Absolutely certain they fall outside the sovereign grant and the crown estate." The answer came back the same each time. Yes, private, her personal estate, directed by her own hand. Elizabeth had never been careless with money. She understood the difference between the institution and the individual better than anyone alive. The public wealth belonged to the crown. The private wealth belonged to the person who had owned, invested, and protected it. In the final years, she had grown increasingly clear about the distinction. Courtiers who once assumed everything would simply pass to Charles discovered, too late, that she had been building a parallel structure for years. Quiet trusts, offshore vehicles that remained perfectly legal, property portfolios held in names that never appeared in the court circular, all of it designed to move, at the right moment, to William. Why William? The question hangs over every corridor now. Some say it was because she saw in him the steadiness she once possessed. Others whisper that she had watched the friction between father and son for too long, and decided the future needed a cleaner foundation. A few of the oldest staff claim she simply loved him with a clarity she no longer felt toward the rest of the family. Whatever the reason, the documents do not lie. The funds were left to William, not to Charles, not to the crown, to William. Charles's shock was not merely about money. It was about legitimacy. For a man who had waited a lifetime to wear the crown, the discovery that his own mother had privately ring-fenced a significant personal fortune away from him felt like a final, quiet verdict. The public still sees a king. The family now sees a monarch whose own parent had chosen to protect the next generation from him. Inside Kensington Palace, the atmosphere is different. William has not crowed. He has not issued statements. He has simply absorbed the information with the same careful neutrality that has become his trademark. Those closest to him say he understood the weight of the gift immediately. It is not a windfall. It is a responsibility. Elizabeth had given him the means to operate with a degree of independence that no previous Prince of Wales had ever enjoyed. The private funds create a buffer. They create options. They create a quiet power that does not depend on the sovereign grant or the geared will of the reigning monarch. The tension between father and son has never been simple. Charles spent decades as the heir who waited. William has spent years as the heir who prepares. The private funds have sharpened that difference into something almost surgical. Charles must now govern knowing that a substantial private resource sits with his son and, eventually, with George. The old expectation that everything flows upward to the sovereign has been quietly rewritten by the woman who understood the monarchy better than anyone. Staff who worked under Elizabeth remember the late-night meetings, the careful instructions, the insistence that certain ledgers remained sealed until after her death. She had watched the tabloid storms. She had watched the marriages fracture. She had watched the institution bend under the weight of modern scrutiny. And she had decided that the next generation needed more than tradition. It needed resources that could not be touched by politics, by parliament, or by a future king's changing priorities. The vault itself is ordinary, steel, climate-controlled, guarded by systems that predate the internet. Inside, the papers are methodical. Spreadsheets, deeds, letters of wishes, a final handwritten note in the Queen's own precise script that leaves no room for ambiguity. The private funds are for William and the children who follow him. Charles is mentioned only in the formal language required by law. The emotional center of the document is elsewhere. When the news reached the wider household, the reaction split along familiar lines. Some of the older courtiers felt a flicker of betrayal on Charles's behalf. Others, younger and more pragmatic, recognized the logic. Elizabeth had always played the long game. She had survived abdication crises, divorces, and the death of a princess who once threatened to outshine the entire institution. She was not about to leave the future of the family to chance or to sentiment. Charles has not spoken publicly. He will not. The palace machine has already begun the careful work of containing the story. Briefings emphasize that the private estate is separate from the public one, that the sovereign grant remains untouched, that the king continues to serve with the same dedication. All of it true, none of it addressing the deeper wound, because the wound is not financial. It is personal. A son who waited a lifetime for his mother's crown has discovered that she quietly prepared a different kind of inheritance for his own son. The public will never see the full documents. The family will never forget them. And in the quiet rooms where the real decisions are made, the balance of power has shifted by a few carefully chosen signatures written in an old woman's hand. The vault is closed again now. The papers are being copied, secured, and locked away once more. But the knowledge cannot be sealed. King Charles III carries it with him into every audience, every walk in the gardens, every moment when he looks at the portrait of his mother that still hangs in the private apartments. She smiled in that painting. She always did. Only now does he understand how much calculation lived behind the smile. William, for his part, has begun the quiet work of understanding what the funds actually mean. Advisors are being consulted, structures reviewed. The future is being measured in new numbers. The Prince of Wales does not speak of victory. He speaks of duty. Yet those who know him best detect a change in the set of his shoulders. He walks a little taller. He carries a secret resource that his father does not share. And somewhere in the distance, the long shadow of Elizabeth continues to shape the monarchy she left behind. The rain still falls on the palace roofs. The guards still change. The public still waves. But inside the oldest walls of the oldest institution, a private truth has taken root. Queen Elizabeth II did not leave everything to the king. She left something more valuable to the man who will follow him. And King Charles, for the first time in a very long life of waiting, has been forced to confront the possibility that his mother's final act of love was not directed at him. The days that followed the vault's opening moved like thick fog through the private corridors of the monarchy. Charles attempted to resume the public rhythm of kingship, audiences, investitures, the careful choreography of state, but those closest to him noticed a change in his eyes. The familiar spark of dry humor had dimmed. Conversations that once ended with a wry remark now ended in silence. He walked the corridors of Buckingham Palace as if measuring the distance between the man he had become and the son his mother had ultimately chosen to trust with her private legacy. Inside Kensington Palace, the atmosphere was quieter, more deliberate. William read every page of the documents himself. He did not delegate the first review. Advisors sat with him late into the night while he traced the lines of trusts, property holdings, and investment vehicles that stretched back decades. Some of the assets had been acquired in the 1970s, others carefully nurtured through the turbulent years of the 1990s and early 2000s. Elizabeth had been patient. She had been methodical. And she had been clear. These resources were never intended to swell the public purse or to cushion the reigning sovereign. They were intended to give the next generation room to maneuver. Catherine watched her husband with the careful attention of someone who understands both the privilege and the burden of inherited power. She asked few questions in the early days. Instead, she created space, quiet evenings, unscheduled walks in the garden, the small domestic rituals that keep a marriage steady when the world outside begins to tilt. Those who saw them together reported no triumphalism, only a shared recognition that the gift carried weight. The private funds would allow William to support causes, secure the future of his children, and operate with a degree of independence that previous heirs had never known. They would also place him, permanently, in a different financial relationship with his father. The wider family felt the tremor. Senior members of the household spoke in lowered voices about precedent and propriety. Some argued that Elizabeth had every right to dispose of her personal wealth as she saw fit. Others muttered that the decision risked creating two centers of gravity inside the institution, one public, one private, and that such a division could prove dangerous in years to come. Charles listened to both sides without committing himself. He had spent a lifetime learning that the monarchy survives by absorbing shocks rather than amplifying them. Yet the shock this time was personal, and the absorption was incomplete. Solicitors on both sides of the family began the careful work of interpretation. The language of the final instructions was precise. There was no ambiguity about the beneficiary. There was, however, room for discussion about timing, structure, and the exact mechanisms by which the funds would move. Charles's team explored every legal avenue available to a sovereign. William's team prepared, quietly, for the possibility that the transfer would proceed exactly as written. Between them stood the ghost of a queen who had always preferred clarity to sentiment. Outside the palace walls, the story began its inevitable journey into the public sphere. First as rumor, then as carefully sourced briefings, then as breathless headlines that reduced a complex private decision to a single explosive phrase. Elizabeth chose William over Charles. The palace issued the expected statements. Private matters remained private. The sovereign grant was unaffected. The king continued to serve. None of it slowed the speculation. Columnists dissected the relationship between father and son. Historians reached for precedents that did not quite fit. Social media turned the revelation into a referendum on loyalty, favoritism, and the true meaning of royal duty. William refused to feed the noise. He continued his public program with the same measured pace. School visits, charity engagements, the quiet work of preparing for a future that now looked slightly different. Those who briefed him said he understood the optics perfectly. Any display of satisfaction would be read as gloating. Any display of discomfort would be read as weakness. The only safe path was silence and diligence. He chose both. Charles, meanwhile, found himself revisiting old memories with new eyes. The long walks at Balmoral, the late-night conversations at Windsor, the moments when his mother had spoken of the future of the family with a seriousness that had once seemed abstract. Had she already been making these arrangements while he sat across from her? Had the smile that never quite reached the private ledgers been hiding a judgment he had never suspected? The questions had no answers, only the cold weight of paper that could not be rewritten. In the weeks that followed, small adjustments began to appear in the household. Certain financial briefings that once flowed automatically to the king were now shared with greater caution. Invitations to informal discussions about long-term strategies sometimes arrived with an extra name on the list. Nothing dramatic, nothing public, just a slow recalibration that occurs when power discovers it is no longer concentrated in a single pair of hands. Elizabeth had understood something fundamental about the institution she served for 70 years. The crown is public. The family is private, and the private resources of the family can either bind the generations together or quietly prepare them for independence. She had chosen the second path for the grandson she believed would one day need it most. Whether that choice was an act of love, an act of foresight, or an act of quiet disappointment remains a question only she could have answered. The documents answer only the practical part of the question. The emotional part lives on in the faces of the two men who must now live with the consequences. Charles continues to carry the crown. William continues to prepare for the day he will inherit it. Between them lies a vault that has already spoken, and a fortune that has already chosen its direction. The public sees continuity. The family sees the subtle fracture lines that even the most careful monarch could not entirely prevent. And somewhere in the private rooms where the real history of the House of Windsor is written, the final signature of Elizabeth II still rests on paper that will outlast every living member of the generation she left behind. The rain has stopped. The palace roofs shine under a pale English sky. Guards change. Flags rise. The institution moves forward because it must. Yet inside the oldest walls, two men, father and son, king and heir, now share knowledge that cannot be unlearned. The queen is gone. Her private funds remain. And the future of the monarchy has been quietly, irrevocably rewritten in her hand.